The prophecy of 70 weeks in chapter 9 of the book of Daniel tells how Daniel, pondering the meaning of Jeremiah's prediction that Jerusalem would remain desolate for 70 years, is told by the angel Gabriel that 70 years should be taken as 70 weeks of years. Summary. Daniel reads in the book of Jeremiah that the desolation of Jerusalem will last 70 years, and prays for God to act. The angel Gabriel tells him that his instruction went forth when he began to pray for the holy mountain of God. Gabriel then explains the true meaning of Jeremiah's words. 70 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. 25 Know therefore and understand, from the time that the word went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the time of an anointed prince, there shall be 7 weeks, and for 62 weeks it shall be built again with streets and moat, but in a troubled time. 26 After the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing, and the troops of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. 27 He shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall make sacrifice and offering cease, and in the place shall be an abomination that desolates, until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator. Composition and structure. Book of Daniel. It is generally accepted that chapters 1 to 6 in the Book of Daniel originated as a collection of folk tales among the Jewish diaspora in the Persian, Hellenistic periods, and were later expanded with the more visionary material of chapters 7 to 12 during the persecution under Antiochus IV in 167–163 BCE. The consensus of modern critical scholarship is that the stories about Daniel and his friends are legendary, and that the eponymous hero of this biblical book most probably never existed. There are references to a person named Daniel in earlier texts. A priest named Daniel accompanies Ezra from Babylon to Jerusalem in Ezra chapter 8 verse 2. A person named Daniel known for his righteousness and wisdom is alluded to in Ezekiel chapter 14 verse 14 and 28-3. And there is also a king named Daniel in the Ugaritic corpus. However, there is no straightforward connection between these figures and the legendary Hebrew prophet named Daniel. Chapter outline. Old Testament scholar John J. Collins observes that chapter 9 can be distinguished from the second half of the book of Daniel by the following 2 facts. The point of departure for the chapter is another biblical text in Jeremiah's 70 years prophecy as opposed to a revelatory vision, and more than half the chapter is devoted to a rather lengthy prayer. Accordingly, Collins divides the chapter into an introductory section that mentions Daniel's reading of Jeremiah's prophecy, the penitential prayer given by Daniel, and the prophecy given by the angel Gabriel following the aforementioned prayer, with a more detailed outline given below. Verses 1 to 2. Introduction, indicating the date and occasion. Verses 3 to 19. Daniel's prayer. An introductory statement in VV. 3 to 4 describes how Daniel set himself to pray. The prayer. Invocation. Confession of sin. Acknowledgement of divine punishment, marked by the passive verb in v. 11b and the switch to God as subject in v. 12. Prayer for mercy. Verses 20 to 27. The revelation. An introductory statement, giving the circumstances in which the revelation occurred. The epiphany of the angel. The angelic discourse, consisting of prefatory remarks. The prophecy of 70 weeks of years. Genre and themes. The Book of Daniel is an eschatology, meaning a divine revelation concerning the end of the present age, a moment in which God will intervene in history to establish his kingdom. It is also an apocalypse, a literary genre in which a heavenly reality is revealed to a human recipient. Literature of this sort was common in the Second Temple period, not only among the post-exilic Jewish community, but also Greeks, Romans, Persians, and Egyptians. Daniel's prayer in VV 3-19 is distinctly Deuteronomistic in implying that God may relent from his punishment in the event his people show penitence. However, this creates an apparent contradiction with the theology of Gabriel's prophetic revelation, which suggests that history is already predetermined and cannot be altered. Hence, Collins suggests that the prayer may only be an act of piety on Daniel's part, and was not intended to influence God into changing the course of history. Historical critical analysis. Historical background: Nebuchadnezzar II defeated Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC and established Babylon as the dominant regional power, with significant consequences for the southern kingdom of Judah. Following a revolt in 597 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar removed Judah's king, Jehoiachin, and after a second revolt in 586 BCE, he destroyed the city of Jerusalem along with the Temple of Solomon, carrying away much of the population to Babylon. Accordingly, the subsequent period from 586 BCE to 538 BCE is known as the Babylonian exile. The exile ended when Babylon was conquered by the Persian king Cyrus the Great, who allowed the exiles to return to Judah via his famous Edict of Restoration. The Persian period came to an end in the first half of the 4th century BCE following the arrival of Alexander the Great, whose vast kingdom was divided upon his death among the Diadochi. The series of conflicts that ensued following Alexander's death in the wars that erupted among the Diadochi marked the beginning of the Hellenistic period in 323 Harbs BCE. Two of the rival kingdoms produced out of this conflict, the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt and the Seleucid dynasty in Syria, fought for control of Palestine during the Hellenistic period. At the start of the 2nd century BCE, the Seleucids had the upper hand in their struggle with the Ptolemaic kingdom for regional dominance, but the earlier conflicts had left them nearly bankrupt. The Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV attempted to recoup some of his kingdom's fortunes by selling the post of Jewish high priest to the highest bidder, and in 171 BCE the existing high priest was deposed and murdered. Palestine was subsequently divided between those who favored the Hellenistic culture of the Seleucids and those who remained loyal to the older Jewish traditions. However, for reasons that are still not understood, Antiochus banned key aspects of traditional Jewish religion in 168 BCE, including the continual offering. Context within chapter 9 verse 1 sets the time of Daniel's vision as the first year of Darius son of Ahasuerus, by birth a Mede. No Darius the Mede is known to history, but it can be assumed that the author means 539 BCE. Verse 2 tells how Daniel reads in Jeremiah that God has allotted 70 years for the devastation of Jerusalem. The verses are presumably Jeremiah 25-11-12 and 29-10, and the meaning is straightforward. Babylonian hegemony would last for 70 years, followed by punishment for Babylon and restoration for Judah. Jeremiah probably did not intend his 70 years to be taken literally. The figure represents a normal lifespan, and Jeremiah was telling his readers that their exile would last for the remainder of their lifetime, but his prestige was greatly enhanced when Babylon fell to the Persians in 539 BCE. Proving his prophecy approximately correct. Daniel is set in the courts of Nebuchadnezzar and Darius the Mede, but commentators since the 3rd century have dated it to the time of Antiochus. But Jeremiah's 70 years could not apply literally to Jews in the time of Antiochus, so the author of Daniel provided a creative solution. Jeremiah's Shivim years is to be understood as Shavim Shivim, 77s, or 490 years. The resulting prophecy is one of the most controversial in the Book of Daniel. Many proposals have been put forward, but none yield historically significant dates when projected 490 years into the future, and as a result there is no consensus. Analysis of Daniel's prophecy. The 70 weeks of years are divided into 3 periods of time: a 7-week period spanning 49 years, a 62-week period spanning 434 years, and a final period of 1 week spanning 7 years. The first period of 7 weeks begins with the departure of a word to rebuild Jerusalem and ends with the arrival of an anointed prince. This word to rebuild Jerusalem has generally been taken to refer to Jeremiah's 70 years prophecy and dated to the 4th year of Jehoiakim in 605 quarters BCE. Collins objects to this identification on the basis that he word to rebuild Jerusalem could scarcely have gone forth before it was destroyed, and prefers to see this as a reference to the word that Gabriel came to give Daniel in v. 23. Other possible candidates suggested by critical scholars include the Edict of Cyrus in 539 8th BCE, the decree of Artaxerxes I in 458 BCE, and the warrant given to Nehemiah in 445 BCE. The word translated as prince in v. 25a may refer to either an actual prince or some other figure of authority, and critical scholars have proposed various candidates for this figure as well, including Cyrus, High Priest Joshua, Zerubbabel, Shushbazzar, Nehemiah, and even the collective people of God in the Second Temple period. Following the subsequent period of 62 weeks, during which time the city is rebuilt, an anointed one shall be cut off. This anointed one is generally considered to refer to High Priest Onias III, whose death at the hands of Seleucid officials outside Jerusalem in 171 BCE is recorded in 2 Maccabees 4:23-28. The identification is further supported by the fact that most critical scholars see another reference to Onias's murder in Daniel chapter 11 verse 22. Though Ptolemy VI and the infant son of Seleucus IV have also been suggested. On the other hand, the identification of the latter, anointed one, with Onias raises the question of how 7 plus 62 equals 69 weeks of years could have elapsed between the departure of the word in v. 25a, which is not earlier than 605 quarters BCE, and the murder of Onias in 171 BCE. Some critical scholars follow James A. Montgomery in thinking that there has been a chronological miscalculation on the part of the writer, who was then criticized for making wrong-headed arithmetical calculations, while others like John Golding are not inclined to see this as a chronological miscalculation, on the basis that the 70 weeks are not an exercise in literal chronology, but the more inexact science of chronography. Collins opts for something like a middle ground position in saying that the figure should be considered a round number rather than a miscalculation, and there are still others who see the calculations as being at least approximately correct, so long as the initial 7-week period of 49 years can overlap with the 62-week period of 434 years. With the latter period spanning the time between Jeremiah's prophecy in 605 quarters BCE and Onias's murder in 171 BCE. Verse 26 introduces a prince who is to come, who will destroy the city and the sanctuary. This is usually taken to mean Antiochus, but may be the leader of the pro-Greek faction within Jerusalem, a certain Menelaus, remembered in 2 Maccabees as the cause of all the trouble, and responsible for the murder of Onias and for the plundering of the temple. The angelic explanation ends with the events of the final week of years, when sacrifices and offerings are stopped in the temple and an abomination that desolates put in the place. The abomination is probably a reference to the sacrifice of a pig to Zeus Olympius in 167 BCE. halfway through the 7 years between the murder of Onias and the cleansing of the temple by Judas Maccabee in 164 BCE. Judgment is then poured out upon the desolator, a reference taking in Menelaus, Antiochus, and their false god. Theological reception. In the field of Christian eschatology, 4 major approaches to interpreting the Bible's prophetic books emerged over the centuries: historicism, preterism, futurism, and idealism. Christian historicism interprets prophecy as an overview of the history of the Christian Church, comparing the books with history to determine which events have already occurred and which are still to come. This approach was particularly associated with Protestantism and the Reformation, and although its heyday was in the 18th and 19th centuries, it still has many followers, including Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses. Seventh-day Adventists identify the beginning of the 70 weeks of years, and the departure of the Word in v. 25a, with the decree given to Ezra in the 7th year of Artaxerxes I, which is dated on this view to 457 BCE. The appearance of an anointed ruler at the end of the 69 weeks of years in v. 25a refers to the baptism of Jesus in 27 CE, and the cutting off of the anointed one in v. 26a is then understood to refer to the crucifixion of Jesus 3.5 years later, bringing an atonement for iniquity and everlasting righteousness. In this way, Jesus confirms the covenant mentioned in v. 27a between God and humanity via his death on the cross in the spring of 31 CE, which is also the midpoint of the last week of years. At the moment of Jesus' death, the curtain between the holy place and the most holy place in the temple was ripped from top to bottom, marking the end of the sacrificial system. The final week of years then ends in 34 CE, when the gospel was redirected from the Jewish people to all peoples. Representative exegetes associated with this view include D. W. Hengstenberg, N. Andrews, B. Pusey, Charles Boatflower, and Uriah Smith. Jehovah's Witnesses believed that the 70 weeks of years began when Nehemiah went to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem in the 20th year of Artaxerxes I in 455 BCE. On this view, the 69th week ended in 29 CE when Jesus was identified as the Anointed One at his baptism. Jesus was then cut off halfway through the final 70th week, which ended in 36 CE. Preterism reads each prophetic book in terms of its immediate historical context. According to this perspective, the departure of the Word in v. 25a is typically believed to have occurred when Artaxerxes I issued his decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 458 BCE, and the beginning of the final 70th week of years is then identified with the baptism of Jesus in 26 7th CE. The crucifixion of Jesus in 30 CE marks the halfway point of this final week, whose death as the Anointed One confirms the covenant mentioned in v. 27a. The final week terminates in 33 CE with Paul's conversion, Peter's vision of the unclean animals, and the baptism of non-Jewish believers. Futurism interprets prophecies as relating future events that have yet to occur. Such futurist beliefs usually have a close association with premillennialism or dispensationalism. Those who adhere to the latter characteristically envision the fulfillment of Daniel's 70th week as a series of events belonging to the future, while adherents of historic premillennialism may not see the fulfillment of Daniel's 70th week as belonging to the future, yet will retain the thesis that many of the prophecies found in the Old Testament are yet to be fulfilled in the future. Dispensationalism holds that God has related to people in various ways under different biblical covenants across a series of historical periods, or dispensations, as a theological system of thought. Dispensationalism was first developed in the writings of John Nelson Darby within the context of the Plymouth Brethren movement. and popularized through the expository notes written by C.I. Scofield in his Scofield Reference Bible. The theology of dispensationalism consists of a distinctive eschatological end-times perspective, as all dispensationalists hold to premillennialism and most hold to a pre-tribulation rapture. Dispensationalists believe that God has yet to fulfill his promises to Israel, which will result in a millennial kingdom and third temple where Christ will rule the world from Jerusalem upon his return for 1,000 years. The Anointed One, at the end of the 7 plus 62 equals 69 weeks of years, is identified with Christ. But since 483 years from 445 quarters BCE would extend to 39/40 CE, which is somewhat beyond the lifetime of Christ, these years are reduced to 476 years by understanding them to be so-called prophetic years, in which each prophetic year consists of only 360 solar days. Consequently, the 69 weeks of prophetic years end with the crucifixion of Jesus in 32/3 CE. The 70th week is separated from the 69th week by a long period of time identified as the Church Age, hence, the 70th week does not begin until the end of the Church Age, at which point Christ's Church will be removed from the earth in an event called the Rapture. Finally, the future Antichrist is expected to oppress the Jewish people and bring upon the world a period of tribulation lasting 3.5 years, constituting the second half of the delayed 70th week. Representative exegetes associated with this view include Joseph Seiss, Robert Anderson, I. Scofield, S. Schaeffer, and H. A. Ironside.